Hello everyone again. Tonight, the United States is sending one of its strongest messages in years to China and Russia, as American defense officials warn that accelerating military buildups by both countries are reshaping global security and raising the risk of confrontation. Senior U.S. leaders say the warning is not symbolic. It is strategic, deliberate, and tied to visible movements of forces, weapons development, and expanding alliances across Europe and the Indo-Pacific. Behind the scenes, subscribe to my channel and like guest video. Pentagon assessments show that the pace of military modernization in Beijing and Moscow is no longer gradual. It is rapid, coordinated, and increasingly designed to challenge U.S. influence in key regions. American officials say the message to both capitals is clear. The United States is prepared, aligned with allies, and watching closely. At the Pentagon today, defense leaders emphasized that the U.S. does not seek conflict with either China or Russia, but they made it equally clear that deterrence requires strength, clarity, and the willingness to respond if red lines are crossed. According to defense planners, ambiguity invites miscalculation, and miscalculation in today's environment could escalate faster than at any time since the Cold War. The warning comes as China continues its largest military expansion in modern history. U.S. intelligence assessments describe a sweeping transformation of the People's Liberation Army, including new naval vessels, long-range missile systems, advanced cyber capabilities, and a rapidly expanding nuclear arsenal. American officials say the scale and speed of this buildup suggests long-term ambitions that go far beyond territorial defense. U.S. commanders in the Indo-Pacific say Chinese naval patrols and air operations near Taiwan have increased in frequency and complexity. These operations, according to U.S. assessments, are not routine training. They are rehearsals designed to test response times, coordination, and international resolve. American officials say this behavior raises serious concerns about regional stability and freedom of navigation. At the same time, Russia continues to invest heavily in its military despite economic pressure and ongoing conflict. U.S. officials say Moscow is prioritizing missile technology, electronic warfare, and strategic weapons designed to counter NATO capabilities. Intelligence officials warn that Russia's military posture increasingly relies on unpredictability as a tool to deter Western involvement and intimidate neighboring states. Senior U.S. officials say the concern is not just what China and Russia are doing individually, but how their actions intersect. Joint military exercises, shared technology development, and aligned diplomatic messaging are being closely monitored. While U.S. intelligence does not describe the relationship as a formal alliance, it is increasingly viewed as a partnership with shared interests in weakening U.S.-led global norms. In response, the United States is accelerating its own military readiness. Defense officials confirm that force posture adjustments are underway across multiple regions. These include increased rotations of U.S. troops, expanded joint exercises with allies, and enhanced missile defense systems. Officials stress these steps are defensive, but they are also meant to leave no doubt about U.S. capability. NATO leaders echo this stance, saying the alliance is facing the most complex security environment in decades. European officials say Russia's actions have fundamentally changed how defense planning is approached on the continent. Increased defense spending, rapid deployment forces, and closer coordination with the United States are now seen as necessities, not options. In Asia, U.S. allies are also responding. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and others are deepening security cooperation with Washington. American officials say this is not about containment, but about preserving balance. The U.S. message is that a stable region depends on respect for international law and peaceful resolution of disputes. Behind closed doors, U.S. diplomats are also delivering warnings directly to Beijing and Moscow. Officials familiar with the discussion say the tone is firm but measured. The United States is signaling that while dialogue remains open, aggressive actions will carry consequences. These consequences, they say, would be economic, diplomatic, and if necessary, military. The White House emphasizes that deterrence works best when combined with communication. Officials say the goal is to prevent conflict, not provoke it. But they acknowledge that deterrence requires credibility, and credibility requires visible readiness. Military analysts note that today's warning reflects a broader shift in U.S. strategy. Rather than focusing on one primary rival, the United States is now preparing for a world where multiple major powers can challenge its interests simultaneously. This reality, analysts say, is driving changes in defense planning, budgeting, and global engagement. Critics of U.S. policy argue that stronger military postures risk fueling an arms race. Supporters counter that failing to respond would invite greater instability. For now, U.S. officials say the choice is clear. Standing still is not an option. As tensions rise, the coming months are expected to bring more military exercises, more diplomatic signaling, and more scrutiny of every move made by Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. The stakes, according to U.S. officials, are nothing less than the future balance of power. The anchor pauses, then continues. The United States says its warning is not a threat, but a statement of reality. In an era of rapid military expansion and shifting alliances, clarity may be the strongest tool left to prevent conflict. The anchor resumes with a steady cadence, emphasizing gravity without alarm. Sources inside the administration say the warning to China and Russia is rooted in lessons learned from recent conflicts. U.S. officials believe that delayed responses and mixed signals in the past allowed adversaries to push boundaries. This time they say the approach is different. Expectations are being set early, publicly, and repeatedly. In Washington, lawmakers from both major parties appear unusually aligned on the issue. Congressional leaders say concerns about China and Russia are no longer partisan debates, but national security imperatives. Defense authorization bills reflect this shift, with expanded funding for naval forces, space defense, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare. Pentagon officials say the nature of modern conflict has changed. Military power is no longer measured only by tanks and troops. Cyber attacks, disinformation campaigns, satellite disruption, and economic coercion are now central tools. U.S. intelligence agencies warn that both China and Russia have demonstrated increasing sophistication in these areas. According to intelligence briefings, China is investing heavily in technologies designed to limit U.S. access to the Western Pacific. These include anti-ship missiles, hypersonic weapons, and advanced surveillance systems. U.S. commanders say these capabilities are intended to challenge American naval dominance and complicate defensive allies. Russia, meanwhile, is described as leaning into hybrid warfare. U.S. officials say Moscow blends conventional military power with cyber operations and political interference to achieve strategic goals without triggering full-scale war. This approach, they warn, makes deterrence more complex and requires constant vigilance. The United States says it is responding by strengthening integration across military branches. Joint operations between the Army, Navy, Air Force, Space Force, and Cyber Command are becoming the norm rather than the exception. Officials say future conflicts would unfold across land, sea, air, space, and cyberspace simultaneously. Allies play a critical role in this strategy. U.S. defense leaders emphasize that no single country can address global challenges alone. Joint planning, shared intelligence, and interoperable forces are now central pillars of U.S. security policy. Officials say this collective approach sends a powerful message to potential adversaries. China has publicly rejected U.S. warnings, accusing Washington of exaggerating threats and fueling confrontation. Chinese officials maintain that their military modernization is defensive and aimed at protecting sovereignty. However, U.S. analysts note that China's actions often extend far beyond its immediate borders, raising doubts about those claims. Russia has responded with similar rhetoric, framing U.S. warnings as hostile and destabilizing. Russian officials argue that NATO expansion and U.S. military presence near its borders leave Moscow no choice but to strengthen its defenses. U.S. leaders counter that sovereign nations have the right to choose their own security arrangements. Behind the rhetoric, diplomatic channels remain active. U.S. officials say maintaining communication is essential to avoiding accidental escalation. Military-to-military hotlines, diplomatic talks, and crisis management mechanisms are all being emphasized as safeguards in an increasingly tense environment. Experts warn that the risk of miscalculation is real. With more ships, aircraft, and troops operating in close proximity, a single incident could spiral quickly. This is why officials say clear warnings and established rules of engagement are critical. Economic factors also shape the confrontation. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and technology controls are increasingly used as tools of competition. U.S. officials say economic pressure is meant to deter aggressive behavior without resorting to force, but they acknowledge that it can also deepen rivalries. Public opinion within the United States reflects growing concern. Polls show Americans are increasingly aware of global tensions and supportive of maintaining strong defenses, though many also fear the costs of prolonged rivalry. Leaders say balancing security and stability is one of the defining challenges of this era. As the anchor continues, the focus shifts to what comes next. Defense officials say the coming years will test whether deterrence can hold. They stress that warnings alone are not enough. Consistency, unity, and follow-through will determine whether rivals take U.S. messages seriously. For now, the United States says it remains committed to preventing conflict while preparing for every possibility. The warning to China and Russia, officials insist, is not about provoking fear. It is about drawing clear lines in an increasingly uncertain world. The anchor looks into the camera once more. The message from Washington is unmistakable. The era of unchecked military expansion will not go unanswered, and the balance of power is no longer an abstract concept. It is being shaped, day by decisions made in capitals around the globe. Military planners say one of the most significant shifts underway is how quickly crises could unfold. Unlike past decades, warning times are shrinking. Satellite surveillance, real-time intelligence, and rapid deployment forces mean decisions that once took weeks may now take hours. U.S. officials say this reality leaves little room for hesitation or misreading intentions. Inside the Pentagon, scenario planning increasingly focuses on simultaneous pressures. Defense leaders acknowledge that China and Russia do not need to act together formally to strain U.S. resources. Parallel actions in different regions could stretch attention, logistics, and diplomatic bandwidth. This possibility is now central to American defense planning. U.S. officials emphasize that deterrence is not solely military. Strategic messaging, alliance solidarity, and political resolve are all considered essential components. Senior officials say the warning to China and Russia is designed to reinforce all three at once, signaling unity at home and abroad. In the Indo-Pacific, freedom of navigation remains a flashpoint. U.S. Navy patrols continue in international waters where China asserts expansive claims. American commanders say these operations are lawful and necessary to uphold international norms. Beijing, however, views them as provocations, increasing the risk of confrontation at sea. Taiwan remains one of the most sensitive issues. U.S. officials reaffirm that policy has not changed, but they also stress opposition to any unilateral attempt to alter the status quo. Intelligence assessments suggest China is improving its ability to apply military pressure without immediate invasion using blockades, cyber operations, and psychological tactics. In Europe, the focus remains on Russia's long-term intentions. NATO officials say even as active conflict dominates headlines, Moscow is planning beyond the present. Investments in strategic weapons and force restructuring indicate preparation for a prolonged period of confrontation with the West. U.S. defense leaders say transparency is intentional. By publicly discussing concerns and responses, Washington aims to reduce uncertainty. Officials argue that secrecy can sometimes increase risk, while clarity can reinforce deterrence. Not everyone agrees with this approach. Some analysts warn that constant warnings and military displays could harden positions in Beijing and Moscow. They argue that security dilemmas can spiral, where defensive moves are interpreted as offensive threats. U.S. officials respond that restraint without strength has historically failed to prevent aggression. The role of emerging technology is another major concern. Artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, and space-based systems are reshaping military calculations. U.S. officials say both China and Russia are investing heavily in these areas, seeking advantages that could offset traditional U.S. strengths. Space has become a particular focus. American officials warn that satellites critical to communication, navigation, and early warning are increasingly vulnerable. The United States has made clear that interference with these systems would be viewed as a serious escalation.